In the last module, we talked about hosted controls being kind of the black box or the building blocks for how you're going to build these unified service desk applications. And if they're the building blocks or the black box for how this functionality is going to be used, the next items that we're going to talk about are the triggers or the actions that are going to fundamentally control what information is displayed inside those hosted controls, or even more appropriately, what information gets displayed and when. So think of the next few items that we're going to talk about as now the driving force behind how that data gets populated and when that data gets populated. And so in this module, we're going to look at three kind of core options, what are called action calls. So the action calls that actually physically populate information inside the application. We're going to look at what are called toolbars. So creating toolbars inside and available for different hosted controls to be able to control functionality so people can initiate commands inside the application. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about events and using events to trigger specific functionality inside the application as well. Those will ultimately control how those hosted controls are interacted with and what specific information displays inside those hosted controls. So really at the cornerstone of triggering functionality inside the application, there's two options here. There's what are called the UII actions, and then there's what are called action calls. Now the UII actions, if you think of UII actions, think of them almost like a function declaration or a declaration of what I want to happen inside the application. So they have specific actions that control what happens in regards to that hosted control. So behind the scenes of these different hosted controls, there's actually coded functionality. So there's things that code the specific functions that need to happen. So opening this page, closing this page, minimizing, maximizing, all of these different specific functions that need to take place all take place or are what are called a UII action. And so that's why when we talked about towards the end of the last module with the ability to create or code your own hosted controls, what you would be doing, one of the things you would be doing with those hosted controls is you would be creating the UII actions that go up along with those individual options. Now, in addition to the UII actions, you also have what are called action calls. So if you think about the UII action as the function declaration, think about the action call as the call to that specific function. So I want to open this page, or I want to execute this UII action that's associated with this hosted control. This defines the specific action on that specific hosted control and then executes that in the application. Now what's neat about these action calls is it takes that action and it allows you to pass session information from the actual application inside that action call to do something on a more tailored level. So they typically are associated with some type of event or some type of triggering functionality. Could be an event, it could be somebody pushing a button, it could be a navigation rule, it could be any number of situations. Now let's talk a little bit more about each one of these in a little bit more detail. Let's first talk about UII actions. So when we start talking about UII actions, these are some of the examples that you would see inside the application. So like for example, the first one that you see, like navigate. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to call the navigate functionality. The navigate functionality is going to allow me to navigate somewhere. I'm going to use an action call to actually specify where I want to navigate to. So I'm going to say on this hosted control, I want to use the UII action to navigate somewhere, and then it's going to allow me to navigate to there based upon the action call. I want to close the hosted control. I want to do a search. One of the key ones that you have is kind of what's called a default. The default is really the underlining baseline no functionality. It really doesn't do anything but load the hosted control. So that way, if you call the default for a specific hosted control, it's just going to load that hosted control inside the application so you can do something with it. All of these are baseline kind of hard-coded into each one of your individual hosted controls. Now let me show you what I mean by this inside the application. So we're going to hop back into Dynamics 365 and we'll give you kind of an example of it. So if I go into settings and I go into Unified Service Desk and I go into my hosted controls, for example, let me go ahead and open up the account hosted control. And if I go into the account hosted control and I go into the related items, I'm going to see UII actions. And if I click on this UII actions, these are the actions that are associated with this hosted control. And since this is a CRM page, since when we designed this hosted control, we designed it as a CRM page hosted control, all of these UII actions got specifically populated automatically. So if I went into the contact hosted control and I open that up, I'd see all of these same UII actions because these are hard-coded into the application as a part of that particular hosted control. And so this is what is controlling things about like when things pop up. So this is if I wanted to pop up a window, I could call the UII action pop up. If I wanted to close a window, I could call the UII action close, and then I could specify how I want to close that. So all this is doing is performing that action inside the application. I still need to initiate it in some capacity, and that's where an action call comes into play. But each one of these hosted controls will have different actions associated with it or different UII actions associated with it based upon the type of hosted control that it is. So like for example, this Bing one, if I open up this Bing one and I look at some of the different actions associated with this Bing one, I can see that I have a few different ones, not quite as many as I had before. I still have new page, I still have pop-up and close and set size, but I don't have quite as many specific ones as we had within the other environment. Now, if I go into that hosted control for that global manager, I have a lot of specific ones in there that are unique to the fact that that runs within the global context. But one of the things that you'll notice for each hosted control that we go into is it will have an action for default for each one of them. And that every single one of the hosted controls should have a UII action called default that basically does nothing. And all it does is open up that hosted control. So when you want to call the default action, you call the default action, and if it can't find anything else, it just populates that hosted control inside the application based upon other functionality that we're pulling in. So this is, you're not going to change how it opens or what it opens, but these are hard-coded actions that are specifically associated with this hosted control type, and these are the ones that we would now call moving forward through what are called action calls. So let's examine that whole action call UII action relationship in a little bit more detail. So this is an example of an action call. And so we talked a little bit about an action call being kind of the declaration of that function, saying this is the function that I want to call inside the application. So when you create an action call, you do a couple of different situations. So the first thing you can see on this screen is where it says action, it says hosted control. This is where I'm specifying the hosted control that I want to apply this action call to. So in this case, I have a hosted control called email that I want to go ahead and open up or use inside the application. The next thing that I have is the UII action. So this is saying what is the action or the UII action that I want to do on this hosted control. So in this case, I want to open up or call the new CRM page. And so what this does is this opens up kind of a new entity record inside Dynamics 365, opens it up almost like a pop-up window inside the application, and then there are specific parameters that I can define in regards to how I want to open this up. So what you're seeing here is when you create an action call, you say, okay, this is the hosted control that the action call is going to be associated with. This is the specific functionality or the action that I want to execute inside the application, and then this is the data that is going to populate how that information moves forward. So let's take you back into the application here and show you this on a little bit more kind of default layer here. So let's pop back into the app. So I'm back in Dynamics 365 and I'm going to go into action calls. And so here I can see a bunch of different action calls that have already been created inside the application that are doing specific situations. Now, the first one that I want to just draw your attention to, and we'll show you this one here in a little bit later, is the debugger, because this is a real easy one to kind of demo and show. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the debugger. So what you can see in this situation is this action call is, in essence, opening up the debugger. So when somebody calls this action call, I have an action call called debugger. When I click on the button, it's going to open it up or execute it on the hosted control debugger, and the action that it's going to take is it's going to perform the default action, which in this case is to just open up that hosted control. Now, one of the things that you'll see in here is as you select these different actions, there's typically tooltips down towards the bottom to tell you exactly what that specific action is going to do in that scenario. And if there's any specific parameters or items that are corresponded with that, it kind of shows you that. So in this case, the debugger in this scenario is just opening up the debugger and executing the debugger. Let's show you a couple of other options or a couple of other action calls that are in here so you can kind of see, how these individual situations work. Let's go into another one. Let's do the load case agent script. So we're going to go ahead and open this one up. So in this situation, it's running on the agent scripting. This has an action called go to task, and what it's doing is it's going to a specific task. And so in this case, we have a task called welcome to case session that is going in and opening up that case session inside the application. And so this is how these action calls kind of work together. Let me show you one more and then we'll create one so you can kind of see how this works here a little bit. So I'm going to go into kind of my one final one I want to show you here. So here I have one called load dashboard, and I have one called load dashboard for global session. Let's go ahead and open this one up here first. Actually, let's back out of this one here. And so what this one is doing is this is loading a specific dashboard. So this is when and an example of this is when USD first loads. You know when USD first loads, it loads up that specific dashboard. This is what is controlling that. So what it's doing is it's running on a hosted control called dashboard. It's navigating to a specific URL, and then in this case, we supply the URL of the item that we want it to navigate to. So this is a dashboard URL inside Dynamics 365. And so this is an example of how these action calls all start kind of working together to constitute what's going to be displayed inside the application. So for example, if I was going to create a new action call, I would go ahead and click on new. I would give it a name. So in this case, I'm going to just call this sample. Then I would go down and I have to specify the hosted control that I want to execute this on. And so this will show me all of my different hosted controls inside the application. So I can see that I have the account, and if I browsed out, I can go through contact. Let's just go ahead and use account for right now. Then I go into actions. And when I click on actions, these are the different actions that are associated with this particular hosted control. So do I want to close it? Do I want to open it? Do I want to perform the default action? Do I want to find something? What exactly do I want to do inside this option? And if I click on look up more records, this shows me all of the different options that I would have in here, getting selected counts, moving forward, loading specific areas, navigating to whatever those items are. What I want to show you here as I go through this is as I select a specific action, for example, close, then when it comes down here, I have different parameters that tell me exactly what is going to happen when I choose that particular option. If I were to pick, a different one, close and prompt, now I get an option that tells me what's going to happen with this scenario. So as you select these, it'll start to show you exactly what's going to happen. So this is going to prompt me to save changes before I close this particular hosted control. And it's up to you to determine what specific situation you want to execute this functionality in. All we're doing here is saying when somebody clicks on this action call, this is what I want to happen. I want to, on the account hosted control, I want it to close that hosted control, and I want me to prompt it before it does that. I still haven't necessarily constituted when that's going to take place. That's kind of the next key aspect to that. But this is where I'm now coming in and saying, okay, this is what's going to take place within those functionalities. So I'm going to close and prompt this particular option. Now I would hit save and close, and then I could associate that inside the application. Another option that you have when it starts talking about action calls are what are called sub-actions. And so each action call has, its actions that it's going to do as part of that situation. So the action call is going to initiate this particular action. After that action has been initiated, you can create what are called sub-actions. And so then these sub-actions can now go in and constitute additional functionality. So after this, page has been navigated to or been open, now I want to go in and I want to start executing additional actions on top of that to further customize the experience. Because now maybe this hosted control has been loaded into the application. Now there might be specific parameters or items of subsets of information that I want to interact with. These sub-actions give me the capabilities to do that. Now the key thing is these sub-actions really only execute after the parent action call executes. If it fails, the sub-actions don't actually get executed. So it only looks at a situation where the initial action call executed successfully. I've now loaded this hosted control into the application. Now I'm going to go ahead and execute these sub-actions, which might perform additional functionality. If it fails to load that initial action call, then the sub-actions will get skipped. And then from a performance perspective, the execution time, basically each one of these options has an execution time associated with it. It includes both the parent and the sub-actions. And there's ways that from an application standpoint, you can actually get into controlling how long it takes for things to happen. You can time things out after specific periods of time. It just gives you a little bit more functionality. But action and sub-actions are nice because you can add them onto the initial action call to really further customize what's taking place. So let's go ahead and create an action call. So I'm going to go ahead and click on action calls. And as you remember when we talked a little bit earlier, these are all the different action calls that we currently have within the application itself. Now, depending upon what we want to take place when we're working on something, we can use this to, in context, kind of work through those. So for example, maybe when the application first loads, I have a specific dashboard that I want to load into the application. This is where I could create basically a action call that would be able to facilitate loading that functionality into the application. And so I'm going to go ahead and create a new dashboard or a new action call. I'm going to call this load dashboard. Now, in here I would need to specify what specific action call I want to load or I want to work with in this scenario. Now, we already have an action call called dashboard. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to run this on the dashboard hosted control. So I will go ahead and do a quick little lookup on that, and it'll show me dashboard. Then I'm going to specify the action. So what do I want to do? And again, remember that depending upon the type of hosted control, there are different options that I could choose from. And I could click on any one of these depending upon what the situation is. Now, in my case, I just want to navigate to a specific dashboard inside the application. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just type in navigate. And then down here it tells me, okay, what do I need to do in order to navigate through to this particular item? And so these are those parameters that we were talking a little bit about. So it's asking us, what is the URL of the item that we want to navigate to? And then this is also where I can determine whether or not I want them to actually have any data parameters be captured from this situation. Do I want to hide the ribbon? Do I want to hide the navigation pane? Is there a specific frame that I want to work with? These are basically what are just called name value pairs. So what I would really do in this situation is I would specify first and foremost the URL and then define what the URL is that I want to work with. And then if I wanted to do any of the other information such as hiding the rhythm or hiding the navigation, I would then specify what specific item I wanted to do in this scenario. So in this case, I'll just go ahead and do the URL of the item that I wanted to work with. So we would type in what the URL is. And then this is where if I knew the specific URL that I wanted to work with, this is where I could put that in. From a time perspective, I'm just going to go ahead and paste in the URL of the dashboard I want to use. So if you remember, every item that you work with inside Dynamics 365 will have a URL and will have a GUID associated with it. So if I'm just trying to go ahead and work with a dashboard, the key area that you'll see within your dashboards is that they're always going to go into the workplace, and then they're going to go into dashboards, and then you just need to have the GUID of the dashboard you want to work with, which in this case is signified by this particular option here. So by me going ahead and defining this is the URL of the item of the dashboard I want to work with, this is now going to load up this particular dashboard whenever this action call is referenced. Now, this action call still has to be called. Remember that just by declaring an action call, I'm not necessarily facilitating any functionality inside the application. What I'm doing at that point is I'm very much specifying that this is what I want to happen when I finally do initiate that functionality inside the application. And so later on, as we go through this module, we'll walk through events and we'll talk a little bit more about how we can now take that particular situation, register it on that event, and then load that dashboard into the application. So, you know, we've talked about UII actions, and we've talked about action calls, and we talked about how the action call, you know, initiates whatever it is that you're trying to do, or actually performs whatever it is that you're trying to do, but it doesn't initiate it. We still need some type of way to fire off that action call. And that can be done any number of different ways. And one of the first ways is through a toolbar. And you're going to see a lot of different toolbars within the context of USD. But a toolbar is exactly what you would think of a toolbar being. It has a bunch of different buttons, and those buttons might have drop-down buttons associated with them. They might be split buttons where you have an initial button that you can click on, and then somebody clicks on that button and it drops down another menu. The nice thing about these buttons is typically these buttons have action calls associated with them. So by clicking on a specific button, it's going to execute one or more action calls within the application. So you're going to create almost what's called like a toolbar container. That toolbar container is going to have different tool buttons associated, or toolbar buttons associated with it. Each one of those buttons, when they click on it, will then constitute doing something within it. Now, what's neat about these toolbars is these toolbars can actually be attached to different hosted controls. So I can actually have a toolbar that's associated with the account hosted control that loads specific functionality specific to that item. So let's look at kind of the anatomy of a toolbar. So you'll see when you create the toolbar itself, one of the biggest things that you're going to see is the buttons area. So when you start adding buttons, the buttons area is going to define what that's going to look like inside the application itself. Now, each one of these toolbars, much like you would see from a Dynamics 365 perspective when you start talking about the command bar, each one of these toolbars can actually have visibility conditions associated with it as well. So I can write conditions that control when that toolbar is visible within the application, and I can write conditions that control when that toolbar is enabled inside the application. Now, these are done through JavaScript. It's a little bit outside of the scope of this particular course, but it absolutely is something that can be done. But as you can see within the toolbar itself, there's specific buttons, and each one of those buttons now constitutes something that's going to happen. Now, I can create different images that I can associate with those, and then each one of those buttons has an action call that's associated with it when somebody clicks on it inside the application. And then just like we did within the individual buttons themselves, we have the capabilities to go out and specify whether or not those buttons are enabled or visible. So we can define specific conditions around those individual elements as well. Now, as I mentioned, a button can have multiple situations. So within that button, I can do drop-down menus, or I could do split buttons where I have kind of a combination of functionality inside the application. Now again, let's look at this from a configuration standpoint inside Dynamics 365. So let's hop back into the application. So let's look at a couple of existing ones that we've already worked with in some of our past demos. So let's go into Toolbars. And so here's that main toolbar. So if you remember when we first initially launched the application, we have that main toolbar that shows kind of our baseline information. So here are the buttons that correspond with that inside the application. So here is that main dashboard, that My Work, that reminder, and then that applications option. So as I click on these individual options, this is what's going to constitute displaying that information inside the application. So these are the buttons that are associated with it. As I go into these individual buttons, so for example, if I click on this My Work button and I open this up, This is going to show me the specific actions that are going to take place within that item. So each button now gives me the capabilities to associate it with a image file if I wanted to, which is just a web resource that we would upload into Dynamics 365 and then reference that web resource. It also gives me the capabilities to populate button text. Now, the button text may look a little bit different right now because it's pulling in what are called resources. These are parameters. We're going to talk about parameters in another module, so I'm not going to get into a ton of information on that at this point, but this at least allows you to see, how that button is being displayed. So it populates the name of the button based upon the item that you're working with. And then down here, I can see the specific action calls that are associated with it. So when somebody clicks on this button, the first thing that's going to happen is it's going to load up an action call that loads my work, loads the My Work area, and then focuses on it. So let's look at each one of these in a little bit more detail so you can see how this constitutes in the application. So now when I go into this option, it's going to load up a hosted control called My Work. It's going to use the navigate action, UII action on that hosted control to navigate to a specific dashboard, and that's that dashboard that we talked about, which is the My Work dashboard. Once that action call is complete, so once it navigates to that action call, the next thing that it's going to do is it's going to focus on that action call. So then it's going to use the global manager to do what's called a show tab, or a set focus basically, and it's going to show the tab My Work, and it's going to set the focus on that tab, so that's going to be the active tab inside the application. So you really, when you start building how people are going to interface with this, you really need to constitute all of that information as you're moving forward. Now let's look at one more specific example of this, and then we'll go back into the application. We'll show you, kind of how that kind of defines that. So I'm going to go back into my toolbars, and here is that account navigation toolbar. So this is the toolbar that opens up when we are inside the account entity. Now this one, I can see that I have a back and a forward button. And when I open up the back and the forward button, these actually have image files that are associated with it, and then it basically constitutes what's going to happen when somebody clicks on it. So this shows you kind of the individual error messages, or I'm sorry, individual messages that are associated with that option, so I can see the image file. Now, in addition to this, if I wanted to have just a drop-down menu, one of the things that I could do, let's go back into our main button again, is I can create a toolbar button or a toolbar option that does not actually have any item associated with it. So for example, if I go into, let me close out of here real quick. If I go back into this main one, and on this main one, if I go into applications and I open up applications, you can see that in applications, I don't have any actions, or I don't have any options associated with this button. So when somebody goes to this button, nothing is taking place. However, if I come up into here and I look on this option here, I can see that there is a toolbar buttons option. And when I click on this toolbar buttons, I can see that this opens up additional toolbar buttons. This is what is constituting that drop-down menu. So if I wanted to, I could create a drop-down menu just simply by creating a button on a toolbar that doesn't have any actions associated with it. It just has additional actions. Now, let's look at this inside USD now that we've actually seen how this is set up in the application. So if we go back into Unified Service Desk, now if I click on My Work, I can see that there's that button. It did two things. It initiated those two action calls. The first action call opened up the specific dashboard, and then the second one set focus on it. So now I can see that this My Work option is attached to it. If I click on Applications, I can see Applications is a drop-down. As I go into each one of these options, I have different items that I can click on. This constitutes that drop-down arrow. This is what starts to give you the individualized situations that you can start using moving forward, and this is what gives you all of those items that you can start clicking on and selecting on inside the application. So you can see very quickly how these different toolbars constitute all of these different item applications and all these different elements that you're working with. And that's how toolbars kind of correspond to initiate those individual actions. Another way that you can initiate action calls or functionality inside the application is through what are called events. And basically an event is something significant that takes place inside a hosted control. So that hosted control is starting a new session or something is opening up inside the application. Once that event triggers, then that hosted control basically notifies about that event with specific parameters or details around that event. So what's neat about these events is now when something loads up, I can initiate something based upon that event. So now I'm opening a new session inside the application. Well, when that new session opens, what do I want to do? Well, I want to load the agent script, I want to load the case agent script, I want to load a to-do list, and I want to load a sample agent script on the contact record. So that way, if there are a few different options based upon what they're doing, I can now determine whether or not they are going to initiate this new case based upon the fact that it's a contact, an account, or a case inside the application. So this is where now I can really start to tie those different things together. The application loads, I want to pop up a desktop. So events are really a critical aspect into what happens inside Unified Service Desk. Now there's a lot of different options that you can see, and there's a lot of different events that are out there. Some of the more common ones that you're going to see are going to be like your desktop ready. That basically tells you, fires on kind of the global manager situation. That tells you that the application has been initialized, it's been ready to go, and now you could start to go through and do things like setting up theming if you wanted to. You could pass through parameters to log into a phone system if you wanted to. It basically tells you that all the initial stuff and all the initial items from Dynamics 365 have been loaded. Now I want to start moving that information from there. Or another real common one is browser document complete. Once you basically open up a browser control and that's loaded inside the application and all of the data parameters that need to be captured have been captured, it processes the browser document complete. Now I could go ahead and say what I want to do with that. So I've loaded this item into the application. Now what am I going to do? Now I'm going to fire off an event that says I want to initiate these next functionalities. Same with session closing. Now these events are great because they, again, give you a mechanism to be able to determine how you want to move forward. One of the final things that we'll do in this module, now that we've talked about all of these different options, is we'll create a couple of events with some hosted controls, and we'll initiate some of those actions inside the application, and we'll show you how that works. So as we can see here, when it first loads up and it pops in the dashboard. Now, a lot of times you may want multiple dashboards. Maybe you've got a representative who has 2 or 3 different areas that you want them to be able to navigate to. Now, obviously within the application, I could go in and I could just have them select the dashboard that I wanted them to work with. The other option that I could do within this situation is I would have also the capabilities, if I wanted to actually go out, specify a specific dashboard, and then actually have it load 2 tabs. And that's what we're going to do here, is we're actually going to have it load 2 items into the application interface. And so we're going to do this kind of from start to finish. And this will show you kind of how all this information really comes together as a whole. So I'm going to do first and foremost, the first thing I want to do is I want to create a new hosted control called Dashboard, called Dashboard 2, basically that we can open up and have another dashboard render within the application. So I've gone into Unified Service Desk, I've gone into Hosted Controls, and I'm going to open up my hosted control or create a new hosted control. So I'm going to go ahead and click on New. I'm going to just call this Dashboard 2. Now I'm going to make it a CRM page because I want to load basically Dynamics 365 functionality into the application. Now I want this to also be a global application, so I don't want this to necessarily be session specific. I want this to be able to be opened through the context of multiple sessions. So I am going to go ahead and check this as a global application, and then I'm going to go ahead and just make sure that I have it running within my IE process and that everything looks okay from there. So that part of it is fine. So now I've registered, I've created my hosted control, I have basically a storage container that I can store this hosted control with inside the application. Now I'm going to tie this to an event. So ultimately what I want to happen is once the desktop is loaded into the application, I want this other dashboard to be able to be displayed. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to load that in through an event. Now before I do that, I need to know specifically what dashboard I want to load into that particular item. So I'm going to go ahead and navigate into into settings and customizations. I'm going to customize the system. And I'm just going to click on dashboards, and I'm going to pick one of these specific dashboards that I might want to work with in this situation. And in this case, we'll just go ahead and use the customer service representative dashboard. I'm going to open this up in a new window. And I'm going to just copy the GUID for the dashboard that I want to work with. So if I come over into this situation here, I can see that I've got different properties that are associated with this. And the big thing that I'm concerned with here is the GUID for the actual dashboard that I want to load. So I'm going to just copy this entire GUID for this dashboard. And now I'm going to create an action call that is going to open this up. So I'm going to go ahead and close out of this dashboard. I'm going to go back into Settings and Unified Service Desk. Give it just a sec to load up here. And now I'm going to go to Events. And so what I'm going to do in this event is I'm going to find the desktop ready event, because that's ultimately what loads this information into the application. So I'm going to do a search for desktop ready, and I'm going to open this up. And I can see that if I open up the option down here, it says load dashboard. I'm going to just go ahead and open this up so I can show you kind of what we're going to do. So in here, it is navigating to the existing hosted control called dashboard. And it's basically just navigating to that and loading in the GUID of the item. So for us, if we want to reference a different dashboard as part of this GUID, this is where I could paste in that specific dashboard item that I wanted to work with, and then I could work with it from there. Now in this case, just for time purposes, I'm just going to copy this URL. I'm going to close out of this option. I'm not going to save changes or anything, so I'm just going to cancel out of here. Now I'm going to create a new action call. So I'm going to go ahead and add a new option. I'm going to create a new action call. I'm going to call this load dashboard 2. I'm going to associate it with the appropriate hosted control, which in this case is going to be that second dashboard that we've created. So I'll find that option. I'm going to navigate to it, so I'm going to find the navigate option. And then I'm going to supply the credential information that I want, which in this case is going to just be the URL for the dashboard that I want to work with. So now that I have that information in here, I could save and close this, and I'll also say that this is going to load thirdly. So I'm going to go ahead and save and close this. So now I have basically two things that are going to happen within this option. It's going to load the first dashboard, and then it's going to kind of load the secondary dashboard. So we'll just verify that it saved the changes on this. So I'm going to close out of here, go back into my desktop ready event. Nope, so let's just go ahead and add it real quick. Load dashboard 2. That looks good. Now we'll go ahead and save out of here. So now in this case, if once I'm ready, I have all my information in there, now I can go ahead and open up the Unified Service Desk client again. Now remember, every time you make a change or a configuration change through the Dynamics 365 user interface, you do have to go in and then basically click on and reopen the application. That'll reload the configuration and make sure that any changes subsequently that you've decided will actually show up in there. So in this case, what will happen now is I'll have two dashboards that will populate that I could switch between. So once it opens up, it's going to maximize the application, and then it's going to go ahead and load up both of the two dashboards that I've defined. And so this is where you can now start to see kind of the customization element of this really come into play, because now I've defined two situations. So there's my first dashboard option, and then if I were to, I could click on the second one, and that would open up the second tier dashboard. So this is how you can make some very simplistic changes to this information based upon events that are loading into the application. And I could do this for anything. Anytime a hosted control loads into the application, I could subsequently define what I wanted to do from there. As you can see from this module, there's a lot of options available to you in regards to how you want to start initiating functionality. It all still starts with the hosted controls. The hosted controls have to exist, and you have to have kind of that container for how you want to populate it. But the actions and the action calls are really what's going to define how that information gets populated into that particular action call. And so that's where you need to go in and have kind of a combination of here's the action I want to use, as well as any underlying parameters that are going to define that information. And so in this module, we really focused on three basic areas. We focused on the UII actions themselves, we focused on toolbars, and we focused on events. Remember that the UII actions define the specific action that will take place on that underlying hosted control, whereas the action call defines the specific UII action that we are going to execute. So the UII action is the thing that's going to happen. The action call says, here's the thing that I want, here's the one that I want to execute, and here's the specific parameters associated with it. And it also defines, here's the hosted control that it's going to take place on. Once I've defined the action call and said, here's what's going to happen, I still need to initiate it. And that's where toolbars can come into play. Because on those toolbars, I can create different buttons, and those buttons can have action calls associated with them. And now they could be one or more action calls. So by simply clicking on that button, it is going to execute multiple pieces of functionality. Loading a hosted control into the application, defining what specific hosted control should have focus once it's been loaded. Then from there, I also have the ability, if need be, to associate specific action calls or specific items with events. Now I would have the capabilities to go into that scenario, create an event. Once that event has been completed inside the application, I could now load that functionality and associate it with from there.